You believe you understand the law better than I do. Judge Harrison scoffed, leaning back in his imposing chair, his voice laced with arrogance. The courtroom went silent, every gaze shifting toward the poised woman standing before him. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, she met his smug expression with an unwavering stare, holding onto a truth that would soon turn the entire room upside down. What unfolded next would leave everyone in that courtroom questioning what they thought they knew. Sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the Westgate Judicial Center, casting golden beams across the polished oak floors. The air crackled with tension, an electric hum of uncertainty and expectation. At the defense table sat Naomi Carter, her back straight, hands folded neatly in front of her. Her deep brown eyes moved across the room, taking in every detail. The prosecutor's self-satisfied smirk, the murmurs from the gallery, the rigid posture of the jury as they tried to remain neutral but failed. Beside her, her younger brother, Caleb Carter, gripped the edge of the table like it was his last tether to sanity. He was broad-shouldered mid-30s, his usual confidence drained by weeks of public scrutiny. The charge, resisting arrest, hung over him like a shadow, despite the undeniable video evidence proving otherwise. Naomi reached over and placed a steadying hand on his. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice a quiet reassurance. The truth has a way of surfacing. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and all conversation ceased. Judge Harrison emerged, his black robe billowing as he took long, deliberate strides to his bench. He was a man in his late 60s, with a hawk-like nose, thinning gray hair, and an air of superiority that oozed from every movement. His reputation for being callous and biased wasn't just a rumor. It was a well-documented fact. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the room. Judge Harrison settled into his high-back chair, scanning the room with thinly veiled irritation. When his gaze landed on Naomi, his lips curled into a smirk, as if he had already made up his mind about her. "Let's get this moving," he muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Naomi remained still. She had encountered men like him before. Men who judged her by the color of her skin before they ever listened to a word she had to say. She had long learned to let their arrogance bounce off her like rain on stone. The prosecutor, Stephen Holt, rose from his chair with an exaggerated flourish, straightening his tie as if preparing for a grand performance. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, his voice filled with confidence. "The facts of this case are indisputable. The defendant openly defied law enforcement, and no amount of emotional appeals can erase that." Naomi clenched her jaw, but remained silent. She had vowed to let the legal team handle the arguments, even as every instinct told her to stand up and expose the deception unfolding before her. Holt continued, painting Caleb as aggressive, uncooperative, a supposed menace to society. Naomi's stomach twisted at every manipulation of the truth, every carefully crafted exaggeration. When he finally finished, he sat down with a self-satisfied smirk, as if victory was already his. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Caleb's defense attorney, a young, nervous man who seemed to shrink under the weight of the judge's gaze. "Well," the judge barked impatiently, "are you planning to defend your client, or shall we just assume guilt and move on?" The attorney cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers, his voice barely carrying through the room. Naomi exhaled slowly. This was not going to end well if no one took control. As the trial unfolded, Judge Harrison's contempt for Naomi became more obvious. He cut off her lawyer mid-sentence, dismissed objections with a flick of his hand, and even let out an audible sigh when Naomi was called to testify. "Miss Carter," he drawled, resting his chin on one hand, "I hope you don't intend to waste this court's time with sentimental nonsense. We deal in facts here, not feelings." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here to present the truth, Your Honor," she said, her voice even and unwavering. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by a single glare from the judge. "Very well," he said, the mockery in his tone thinly veiled. "Let's hear this so-called truth." Naomi stood, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She felt the weight of every stare in the room pressing down on her, but she refused to let it shake her. Years of experience had trained her to stay composed under pressure, and she wasn't about to let a condescending judge break her resolve. She spoke with clarity, recounting the events that had led to Caleb's arrest, outlining the injustices he had faced. But every time she attempted to expand on a point, Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone growing more impatient with each passing second. "Miss Carter," he chuckled, shaking his head, "you seem to believe you're some sort of expert on law enforcement. Tell me, do you have actual field experience, or are you just another idealist who thinks she knows better?" Naomi felt a flicker of anger ignite within her, but she forced it down. Now was not the moment. As she returned to her seat, the judge's laughter echoed through the room. She glanced at Caleb, whose hands had tightened into fists. "It's not over," she murmured, her voice firm. "Trust me, it's not over." What Judge Harrison failed to realize was that Naomi Carter was far more than he assumed. And soon, the truth he had dismissed so easily would be the very thing that unraveled his iron grip. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension and barely restrained energy. The grand clock on the wall above the judge's bench ticked steadily, each second stretching the silence to its breaking point. Naomi sat perfectly still, a picture of composure even as emotions churned beneath the surface. She had handled high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This was personal. Across the room, Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk, a deliberate reminder of who held power here. He wasn't just dismissing Naomi's words. He was challenging her very presence in his courtroom. "All right, Miss Carter," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've had your moment. Now, let's return to the real issue. Your brother's blatant disregard for authority." Naomi clenched her hands under the table, pressing them against her lap to steady herself. She inhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to slow. "Control the moment. Don't let the moment control you." It was a mantra that had carried her through countless trials before. But here, under the judge's scrutinizing gaze, it felt like balancing on the edge of a knife. The prosecutor, Stephen Holt, stood again, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a final act. "Your Honor, I believe we've indulged in enough theatrics," he said smoothly. "The evidence is clear. Regardless of the video footage, an officer's testimony is what truly matters." Naomi's lips pressed into a firm line, a flicker of something close to amusement in her eyes. She had watched that footage over and over. It wasn't just evidence. It was undeniable. The arresting officer had escalated the situation unnecessarily, resorting to force over what should have been a simple conversation. She leaned toward Caleb, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're betting on no one questioning their version of events," she murmured. "But they're about to lose that bet." He nodded, though tension still radiated from him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom pulsed with unspoken tension, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. Naomi could feel the weight of the judge's contempt pressing against her like an invisible force, but she refused to yield. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let a man like Judge Harrison dictate the truth. Then, the moment came. Naomi stood, her voice steady, her presence commanding. "Your Honor, you claim to value facts, but you ignore the most damning one of all. The truth is right in front of you, and you're choosing to look away." The room held its breath. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. The jury exchanged uncertain glances. And Judge Harrison? For the first time, he hesitated. The truth was undeniable. The video evidence would dismantle their false narrative. The carefully spun web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread. Caleb squeezed Naomi's hand beneath the table, the faintest spark of hope flickering in his weary eyes. This wasn't just about one case. It was about justice, about challenging a system built to silence the unheard. And as Naomi met the judge's gaze one last time, she knew this fight was far from over. But she was ready.